I'm Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief of USA Today, and this is Capital Download. We're in our New York Bureau with Timothy Geithner, the former Treasury Secretary. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Susan.
You were president of the New York Fed and then Treasury Secretary during the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression. Now you've written a new book about those experiences. It's titled Stress Test: Reflections on Financial Crises, and I've got to say you do look a little stressed in the picture that's on the cover of your book.
There were some moments. There's no doubt about it.
You spent a lot of time writing this book and going back through the events that you were so involved with during this period. And I wonder if, in the process of doing that, did anything surprise you? Did you figure out something that you hadn't understood at the time or gotten some new insight on this period?
I wanted to explain to people, as we face the risk in the future, future financial crises, why it's important to do a better job of containing risk. Even when I look back and go over those things, when we didn't have perfect knowledge, perfect foresight, I feel very confident that the people I was with made very good choices with no good options in the midst of a really terrible crisis. And I think that the choices we made then, even though they were messy, not perfect, they were ultimately very effective, very powerful in protecting Americans from the risk of a Great Depression.
So you wrote, "We did save the economy, but we lost the country doing it." And I assume you mean by that the terrific suspicion there is among a lot of Americans that the banks got bailed out, but they didn't. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, if you look at this, what we faced, it was a classic financial panic. Something that Americans hadn't seen since the Great Depression. There's no memory of that, no understanding of it. To protect people from the risk of mass unemployment, you have to make sure you keep the financial system running, stable, to protect their savings, to make sure people can borrow, businesses can stay open. But that means to do that, you have to do things that look deeply unfair. It looks like you're rewarding the arsonists, the people that were central to helping cause the crisis.
The most frequent criticism of you would be that you were too cozy with the Wall Street banks, that you didn't do enough to rein them in when you were heading the New York Fed, and that the efforts to right the economy, to avoid a depression, gave them too much money and did too little for ordinary people who were really suffering.
It's like, you're in the cockpit and the plane's on fire and smoke is filling the cabin. And you've got a bunch of people in the plane, you got some terrorists or you got some people who built the plane or didn't design the fire system right. And people want you to come out of the cockpit and put them in handcuffs or, beat them up. And it's understandable, but you've got to land the plane safely if you want to protect people from the risk of catastrophe. When you land the plane, then you can figure out how to hold people accountable and make the plane safer in the future. But first you have to land the plane. That's the just and necessary thing to do.
But during this crisis, you've served two very different presidents. Can you give us a kind of a thumbnail assessment of how you thought George W. Bush did during this time? And you were, of course, heading the New York Fed while he was president.
I had a huge amount of respect for what he did at that moment. Again, it was the darkest time in the American economies in 75 years or so. And he put his full support behind what Secretary Paulson and Ben Bernanke were trying to do at that time to break a classic financial panic. And he was decisive and forceful and steadfast at that time, when it might have been easier for him to sort of step back and say, I'll let my successor deal with that.
He is a conservative Republican. You think it was hard for him to agree to these kind of extraordinary interventions?
Of course it was, and I think he's spoken to that. I mean, again, the thing about economies and financial systems is that there are moments when the private sector won't take risk again. Everybody's in massive retreat. It's like a stampede. And in that context, the markets can't function unless the government's prepared to come in, to step in, and provide a basic level of protection against collapse. And I think to a lot of people who believe in markets, and of course I'm a big believer in markets too, it's hard for people to understand that basic point because most people don't live with these things. They happen so rarely. So I'm sure that was hard for him.
And for President Obama, you talked about your admiration for his leadership, but just briefly, is there something else you would say in kind of assessing him and maybe the difference in the approach that he took from President Bush?
My first meeting with him in the Oval Office after I was confirmed, we were there and we were talking about the risks ahead still. And again, the economy at that point was in full collapse. We were losing 750,000 jobs a month at that time. The economy was falling at what turned out to be an 8%, 9% annual rate at that point. And we were discussing what to do at that time. And he said, well, I want you to rip the Band-Aid off. I want to do the hard things now. I don't want to defer them. I want to do the tough, difficult, politically horrible stuff right now so we can get it behind us and have a better chance of having the economy grow again at that time. And he said, don't you worry about the politics. You worry about trying to figure out how to, give me a set of options to solve this problem as quickly as we can. And he didn't, he wanted me to bear the responsibility for recommending a plan, but he subjected those recommendations to a pretty tough, brutal examination and debate. But he was not paralyzed by how hard those choices were. There was no good choices. Not paralyzed by the politics of it. He was willing to decide and to stick with it, support it, and keep at it. And ultimately, the reason why the economy started growing again was because we were able to create enough confidence that the United States would ultimately do what was necessary to save people from the risk of a collapse in that context. And that's to his enormous credit.
What's the best advice you'd give to your successor?
Overwhelming force as quickly as you can on a massive scale. If you do that, again, it seems counterintuitive. If you do that, you're much more likely to protect people from mass unemployment, much more likely to get the economy growing again, much more likely to end up losing, costing the taxpayer less money. And in some ways, you're more able to force the restructuring you need. If things are too fragile, it's hard to force the restructuring you need to make the system stronger. So, you should use overwhelming force and plan for a long war, because these things are hard. They take a long time to heal. Don't stop too soon.
Secretary Geithner, thanks so much for being with us on Capital Download.
Nice talking to you.